The Unseen Legacy, A Millionaire's Awakening. John Carpenter had always considered himself a man of control. As a successful businessman in New York City, his world revolved around structured routines and carefully curated moments. From his morning coffee brewed precisely to his taste, to the hours spent in glass-walled boardrooms overseeing multi-million-dollar deals, every aspect of his life adhered to a set of plans. Each day mirrored the next with only minor deviations. Life had always been predictable, and John had always believed that was the way he preferred it. But that particular evening, a night that began like any other, would change everything. A moment of instinct, an unexpected diversion, and a chance encounter would unravel a hidden truth that would shatter the very foundation of the world John had spent years building. It had been a long day of negotiations. A deal that John had poured weeks into was finally coming to fruition. Yet, despite the financial windfall, John felt the familiar weight of exhaustion settle in. His usual car service was unavailable that evening, leaving him with an unexpected opportunity for solitude. Rather than heading straight home to his penthouse, John found himself wandering the city streets. The crisp night air offered a refreshing contrast to the stuffy offices and sterile boardrooms he had become accustomed to. His mind, heavy with the events of the day, needed the distraction. He turned down a narrow alley, an unfamiliar street that promised to cut through to the other side of the city, a shortcut he had never taken before. The alleyway was dimly lit and littered with trash. Graffiti streaked the walls in chaotic, vibrant splashes of color. John paused for a moment, uneasy, but dismissed the feeling. This was New York, after all, a place where every corner offered an unexpected scene. But it wasn't the graffiti or the discarded garbage that captured his attention. It was a faint sound, almost imperceptible, like the soft whimper of an animal in pain. John's heart skipped a beat. The sound came again, this time louder, weaker, and full of distress. Without thinking, he followed the noise, weaving around forgotten piles of refuse and cardboard boxes. And then he saw her, a small, fragile figure huddled against the wall, her tiny body trembling in the cold. Her hair, tangled and matted with dirt, framed a face that looked far too young for the suffering it had already endured. Her clothes were torn, barely covering her malnourished frame. She could not have been older than 6 years old, yet her eyes, wide with fear and exhaustion, spoke of a much older soul. John felt a jolt of horror pass through him. He was no stranger to the world's harsh realities, having witnessed countless deals that affected the lives of people far removed from his insulated existence. But this was different. This child, abandoned in a dark alley, was something his wealth, his status, and his power could never protect. "Are you okay?" John's voice came out softer than he expected, a mixture of concern and disbelief. The little girl didn't respond. Her lips trembled, but no words came. John crouched down slowly, his movements deliberate, ensuring not to startle her. He could see her arms wrapped tightly around a small frayed blanket that she clung to as if it were her only possession in the world. "Don't be afraid," John said gently, a protective instinct rising within him. "I'm here to help." Still, she didn't respond. John's heart tightened in his chest as he fumbled for his phone, dialing 911. As he explained the situation to the operator, he felt an odd sense of urgency, a desire to do something, anything, to help the child who had been discarded like nothing more than trash. The ambulance arrived minutes later, the flashing red and blue lights illuminating the alley as they carefully lifted the girl onto a stretcher. John, still shaken by the sight of her frail form, followed them to the hospital. He couldn't shake the image of her eyes, wide and untrusting, staring back at him as if she had been abandoned by everyone who was supposed to protect her. The hospital's sterile walls felt cold and unwelcoming, a stark contrast to the warmth and luxury John had grown accustomed to in his own life. The doctors worked tirelessly to stabilize her, malnourished, dehydrated, and traumatized, they said, but stable. John sat in the waiting room, his mind racing. Why was he so affected by this? He had no children of his own, no family to speak of. And yet something in him had shifted the moment his eyes locked with hers. The protective instinct that had long been dormant in his heart had been awakened, and he couldn't ignore it. A doctor finally emerged from the room, her face grave but hopeful. "She's stable," she said, her voice tinged with relief. "Malnourished, dehydrated, and clearly traumatized, but she's going to make it." John nodded, feeling the weight of the words sink in. He had done what he could for now, but there were so many unanswered questions. The girl had not spoken a single word, and the longer John sat there, the more the gravity of the situation weighed on him. "Do you know who she is?" John asked, his voice steady but anxious. The doctor hesitated, flipping through her notes. "We're running her through the system now. There's a missing persons report that might match her description. The little girl named Lily Crawford disappeared 6 months ago." John's stomach dropped at the mention of the name. He didn't know why, but it sent a chill through him. Lily Crawford. That name sounded so familiar. The detective assigned to the case, a stocky man with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, approached John. "Mr. Carpenter, I understand you found the girl," he said, his tone polite but probing. "Do you have any idea who she is or how she ended up there?" John shook his head. "No idea. She was alone, no one else around." The detective's eyes darkened. "We've got a missing persons report that might match her description. If this is Lily Crawford, this could get complicated." "Complicated?" John asked, his brow furrowing. "How?" The detective hesitated. "If this is her, there's a high chance someone close to her put her in that alley. We've seen it before. Guardians or family members who don't want the responsibility anymore." The idea made John's stomach churn. How could anyone, especially someone she trusted, abandon a child like this? As John looked toward the hospital room, his phone buzzed with a message. The text was brief, but its meaning was clear. "Walk away. This isn't your problem." The hairs on the back of John's neck stood up as a cold realization settled in. Someone was watching him, and they didn't want him to get involved. But John was determined. He wasn't going to turn his back on this little girl, no matter the threats, no matter the cost. The hours at the hospital seemed to stretch on endlessly. John paced the hallway, anxiety clawing at him as the detective spoke with the doctors and nurses, working to uncover more about Lily's identity. As the night dragged on, John's mind kept returning to the haunting image of the girl, the fear in her eyes, the quiet whimper she had let out when he first found her. When a nurse finally approached him, her voice soft and uncertain, John felt his pulse quicken. "Mr. Carpenter," the nurse began, "she's awake. Would you like to see her?" John didn't hesitate. He stood immediately, his heart pounding in his chest. He had promised her he would help, and now he was going to keep that promise. John entered the dimly lit hospital room, his heart in his throat. The sterile air, the soft hum of machines, the occasional beeping. It all faded into the background as his eyes settled on the small figure lying in the bed. She looked even smaller now, dwarfed by the large hospital sheets and blankets. Her pale face, too still for someone so young, was partially hidden under the covers. Her once wild hair was now neatly combed, though still tangled and brittle. As John stepped closer, the girl's eyes fluttered open. For a moment, she seemed to gaze right through him, her eyes tired and distant, full of fear and memories that no child should have to bear. But then there was a flicker, a small recognition that passed between them. Her lips trembled, and her hand, gripping the blanket tightly, shifted slightly. "Hi, Lily," John said gently, crouching beside her bed, his voice soft but firm. "Do you remember me? I'm John, the one who found you." The girl's gaze lingered on him for a moment before she turned her eyes down, avoiding him as if the weight of her thoughts were too much to bear. Her lips parted, but no words came out. John could feel the hesitation in the air, thick with the silence that enveloped them. "You're safe now," John reassured her, though his voice felt strained, like he was trying to convince himself as much as her. "No one is going to hurt you." Lily's grip on the blanket tightened, and John could see the faint outline of the silver necklace around her neck, its tiny pendant glinting under the harsh hospital lights. The initials AC were engraved on it, possibly the only trace of a life that once held meaning, a life that had been cruelly interrupted. "Where are your parents, Lily?" John asked softly, hoping for a sign of recognition, or at least a hint of who had left her there. But the girl didn't respond. John could feel his frustration mounting. Where was the support system that every child deserved? How had Lily ended up in that alley, alone and abandoned like that? Just as John was about to speak again, the door to the room opened, and Detective Harris entered, a quiet presence that didn't intrude but loomed like a shadow over the room. He had been tracking down leads all day, piecing together fragments of information, but like John, he had yet to uncover the whole truth. "She say anything?" Harris asked as he approached, his voice a low murmur. John shook his head. "Not yet, but she's starting to trust me." The detective looked from John to Lily, his eyes softening just slightly. He knew the severity of the situation. He knew what had to be done, but there was still so much left to uncover. "We've confirmed her identity," Harris continued, his tone serious. "She's Lily Crawford, daughter of Amanda Crawford. The mother's been missing for years, presumed dead. The father, well, there's no record of him." John absorbed the words like a blow to the chest. Lily's mother, Amanda Crawford, was a ghost, her past now tangled in mystery and unanswered questions. The detective passed John a file, a slim manila folder that contained details of Amanda's life. John opened the folder, his eyes scanning the sparse pages. Amanda Crawford had worked as a waitress in Brooklyn. Unremarkable, really, until her disappearance. There were no close relatives listed, no emergency contacts. It was as though Amanda and Lily had lived on the fringes of society, unnoticed, unprotected. "What happened to her?" John asked, his voice low with concern. He could feel the weight of the mystery pressing down on him. The detective hesitated, clearly choosing his words carefully. "That's the million-dollar question, Mr. Carpenter. CPS has been searching for Lily for months. But after Amanda disappeared, the case went cold. That is, until you found her." John's pulse quickened at the realization. The truth had been so close, yet it had remained hidden from him for so long. "Are you planning to stay involved?" Harris asked. "Because if you are, just know this won't be simple. The more we dig, the more complicated things get." John didn't hesitate. "I can't just walk away, Detective. She's a child. Someone has to fight for her." The detective studied him for a moment before nodding. "Just be careful. There's more to this than you realize, and not all of it's going to be easy to stomach." The night dragged on, and John's mind raced as he sat in the waiting room, turning over the fragments of information in his head. He couldn't let this go. He couldn't just sit idly by while a child who had already suffered so much was left in the hands of the system. The nurse's voice broke through the silence, interrupting his thoughts. "Mr. Carpenter, she's awake. Would you like to see her again?" John stood immediately, his heart racing. Without thinking, he followed the nurse down the hallway and into the room where Lily lay. Her small body was propped up slightly in the bed, clutching the stuffed bear he had brought her. There was a slight color returning to her cheeks, and her eyes, though still full of pain, were no longer completely distant. "Hey, Lily," John said softly, sitting beside her bed. "How are you feeling today?" "Better," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but there was a subtle spark of hope in it. John smiled, relieved by the answer. For the first time, he saw a flicker of light behind her eyes, perhaps a sign that, even in the darkest moments, there was still a glimmer of hope left in her. "I've been thinking a lot about your mom," John continued. "She must have loved you so much." Lily's eyes lowered to the stuffed bear in her hands, her fingers clutching it tightly. "Mommy always said I was her sunshine," she said softly, her voice trembling. John felt his heart break at the tenderness in her words. The love between mother and daughter was evident in that simple statement, and for a brief moment, John could feel the weight of Lily's loss. "You're very lucky," John said, his voice tight. "You had a mom who loved you more than anything." Lily nodded slightly, though her face remained somber. "Do you think she's still alive?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. John hesitated, not wanting to give her false hope. He didn't want to crush her belief that her mother might still be out there. But he couldn't lie to her either. "I don't know, Lily," he said gently. "But if she's out there, we'll find her." Lily looked up at him, her eyes filled with a vulnerability John had never seen in anyone so young. "Promise?" she asked. John took her small hand gently in his, feeling the frailty of it. "I promise," he said firmly, his resolve hardening. "I'm not going to stop until I find out what happened to your mom." Later that day, John found himself once again walking the streets of Brooklyn, the memory of Lily's small voice echoing in his mind. He needed answers. He needed to understand what had happened to Amanda and why she had been driven to fear for her life. And more than that, he needed to protect Lily from whatever was lurking in the shadows. John made his way to the neighborhood around 1423 Belmont Avenue, the address from the photograph he had found in Lily's bag. The area was quiet, with boarded-up houses and overgrown yards, the air heavy with an unsettling stillness. The house stood at the end of a forgotten street, its paint peeling and its porch cracked and worn. It looked abandoned, but John knew better than to judge a place by its exterior. He pushed open the creaky gate and made his way up to the front door. It was unlocked, and as he stepped inside, he was met with the staleness of an abandoned home. Dust coated the furniture, and graffiti marred the walls. The place felt as though it had been left behind in a hurry, as though the people who once lived there had vanished without a trace. John carefully explored the house, his footsteps echoing in the silence. In one of the small bedrooms, he found a pile of belongings shoved into a corner. Among the scattered items, a small notebook caught his eye. The pages were yellowed and torn, but John could still make out the words scrawled on the pages. "If something happens to me, it wasn't an accident. Lily needs to be safe. Trust no one." The words sent a chill down John's spine. Amanda had known something that had led her to live in fear. But who had she been running from? And why had she felt the need to warn someone, to protect Lily even after she was gone? As John flipped through the notebook, a noise startled him from behind. He spun around, his heart racing, but the doorway was empty. The sound of footsteps retreating down the hallway sent a wave of dread through him. Someone had been watching him. He hurried outside, his pulse pounding in his ears. A black SUV was parked a few houses down, its tinted windows obscuring the occupants. But John knew instinctively that the people inside were connected to the threats he had been receiving. They were the ones who didn't want him digging into the past. His phone buzzed with a new message. "Stop now. This is your final warning." John's grip tightened around the phone. He wasn't going to stop. Not now. Not when the truth was so close. John's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the black SUV parked a few houses down. It felt like everything had changed in a moment. The bustling, ever-moving life he had once known, full of mergers, presentations, and the never-ending noise of business, now seemed so distant, so insignificant compared to the reality he faced. This wasn't about the world he controlled with money and influence. This was something deeper, darker, and more dangerous than any deal he had ever brokered. John could feel the weight of the unknown pressing in on him. Whoever was behind the threats, whoever was pulling the strings in the shadows, had already made it clear that they didn't want him to interfere. But John wouldn't back down. Not when Lily was at the center of this, not when the secrets of Amanda Crawford and her hidden life were waiting to be uncovered. His mind was racing as he made his way back to the car, his eyes never leaving the black SUV. He felt the creeping sensation that he was being watched, that every move he made was being tracked. Whoever was in that car knew what he was doing, and they didn't want him to dig any deeper. As he drove back to his penthouse, John couldn't shake the sense of urgency that had taken over him. He had been playing by the rules of his old world, the world of business, for so long. But this wasn't the same world. There were no contracts to sign or boardroom meetings to attend. The stakes were higher now, infinitely higher. When John stepped into his penthouse, the familiar opulence of his surroundings felt cold, like the walls themselves were closing in on him. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of isolation. This was no longer just about him. It was about a little girl named Lily, a missing mother, and the terrifying forces that seemed determined to keep the truth hidden. He poured himself a drink, the amber liquid swirling in his glass as he tried to steady his racing thoughts. He needed to think, to make a plan. He had promised Lily that he would find out what happened to her mother, and John wasn't the type of man to break a promise. The sound of his phone vibrating on the marble countertop broke his concentration. He glanced at the screen. Another message from the unknown number. His finger hovered over the screen, but he already knew what it would say. "You're getting too close. Walk away, or you'll regret it." John's grip tightened around the phone, his jaw clenching with frustration. Whoever was behind this wasn't going to intimidate him. The threats, the warnings, none of it mattered. The only thing that mattered now was finding the truth. He dialed Detective Harris' number, his mind made up. It was time to take control. No more waiting, no more playing by their rules. The detective answered on the first ring. "Harris," John said, his voice low but urgent. "I need your help. It's time to go on the offensive." The following morning, John met with Detective Harris at a quiet cafe in Midtown Manhattan. The detective had been working tirelessly on the case, but like John, he knew they were up against something far bigger than they had initially realized. "You've been digging into Blackwell Security," John began, his voice steady. "What have you found?" Harris took a sip of his coffee before answering, his eyes scanning the room as though making sure they weren't being overheard. "Blackwell's been tied to some high-profile clients. Politicians, CEOs, people who need things done without questions asked. If they're involved in this, we're dealing with something far bigger than a missing persons case." John's stomach tightened at the mention of politicians and CEOs. The realization that someone with power, someone with influence, might be behind the threats made everything feel even more dangerous. "I don't care who they are," John said, his voice colder now. "We need to get to the bottom of this. Whatever is going on here, it doesn't just end with Amanda. This goes deeper, and I need to know why they're trying to keep Lily's mother's disappearance a secret." Harris leaned in, his face serious. "I've been trying to dig up more on Crawford Industries. Your family company, John. There are rumors, whispers about shady deals, stuff your father was involved in. But it's hard to get anything concrete." John stiffened at the mention of Crawford Industries. The company had been the foundation of his success, the empire his father had built. He had always believed it was above reproach. But now, he was starting to question everything he had ever known about his family legacy. "My father's been dead for years," John said, his voice low. "There's nothing left to dig up." "Maybe not," Harris said slowly, "but someone is still pulling strings in that company." The payments to Blackwell Security came from an offshore account tied to Crawford Industries. Someone in your family is still involved. John felt a cold shiver run down his spine. Whoever was behind this, whoever had orchestrated the events that led to Lily's mother disappearing, was someone within his own bloodline. "I need to speak with my uncle," John said, his voice tight. "He's the last one left. He might know more than he's letting on." That afternoon, John made the drive out to his Uncle Henry's estate. It was an imposing mansion, perched on a hill overlooking the city. John had always felt a certain detachment from his uncle, a man who had distanced himself from the family business after his brother, John's father, passed away. Henry had retired years ago, leaving the day-to-day operations of Crawford Industries to John's father. But now, John couldn't help but wonder if his uncle knew more than he had ever let on. When John arrived at the mansion, he was greeted by a housekeeper who led him through the grand hallways to Henry's office. The room was lined with bookshelves, its dark wood paneling giving it an air of authority. Henry sat behind a large desk, his steely blue eyes narrowing as John entered. "John," Henry said with a slight smirk, "what brings you here today?" John didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I need to talk to you about Amanda Crawford." Henry's face tightened, but he quickly masked his emotions. "Amanda? I haven't thought about her in years." "She's dead, isn't she?" John said bluntly. "But her daughter, Lily, is alive. I found her. And I'm trying to figure out what happened to Amanda." Henry hesitated for a moment, his eyes flickering with something John couldn't quite place. But then, with a long, exasperated sigh, he leaned back in his chair. "You're treading dangerous ground, John," Henry said, his voice tinged with warning. "I don't know what you think you're uncovering, but I can tell you this: it's better left buried." John's pulse quickened, but he remained calm. "I'm not leaving until I know the truth, Uncle Henry. What happened to Amanda? Why did she disappear?" Henry's face darkened. "It's not as simple as you think. Your father had his reasons for what he did. Amanda, she was a mistake, a temporary affair that he wanted to keep hidden. She wasn't part of our world, John. And when she got pregnant, your father didn't want the scandal. He paid her off to disappear." John's heart pounded in his chest as he absorbed the revelation. His father had paid Amanda to leave, to vanish. But that wasn't the whole story, not by a long shot. "Is that it?" John asked, his voice low. "You think that makes it okay? You think paying her off to disappear was the answer?" Henry shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his gaze flickering toward the door, as if he feared someone might be listening. "Your father wanted to protect the family's reputation. He did what he thought was best." John felt his fists clench. "And now you think you can just pretend this never happened? That Lily doesn't deserve the truth." "I never wanted any of this to come out," Henry said, his voice strained. "But it's too late now. There are people who will do anything to keep this quiet, John. You need to back off while you still can." John stared at his uncle, his mind racing. Henry knew more than he was letting on. But there was something deeper at play, something far darker than what either of them had realized. "I'm not walking away," John said firmly. "Not now. Not ever." As John left his uncle's mansion, the weight of the conversation hung heavily in the air. He had uncovered the truth about Amanda, but it was clear that someone, maybe even his own family, was determined to keep the rest of the story hidden. The deeper John dug, the more dangerous things became. But there was no turning back now. He had made a promise to Lily, and he would keep it. The truth would come out, and no one, not even the shadowy figures lurking in the dark, could stop him. John stared out of the window of his penthouse, watching the New York City skyline stretch endlessly before him. The city that had once felt like his domain now seemed like a distant place, full of untold stories and untapped mysteries. The once familiar lights of Manhattan now felt like a backdrop to a deeper, darker reality that he was just beginning to uncover. Amanda Crawford, Lily, Crawford Industries, the black SUV, the threats. They all swirled in his mind, a tangled web of fear and intrigue, each piece more dangerous than the last. His uncle's admission had only added to the mounting questions, but it had also fueled John's resolve. Henry had spoken of protecting the family reputation, of silencing Amanda and her daughter, as though it were all just business. But to John, it was more than that now. He had made a promise to Lily, a promise that he would uncover the truth and protect her no matter what. He had promised to bring justice, and he wasn't about to break it. John couldn't ignore the nagging suspicion that whoever had been pulling the strings behind Amanda's disappearance and the cover-up of her life had ties much closer to home than he had ever imagined. The connections between Blackwell Security and Crawford Industries were no coincidence. Someone in his family had orchestrated this, And the deeper he dug, the more he realized just how dangerous the forces at play were. The message from his uncle had rung in his ears long after their conversation. "There are people who will do anything to keep this quiet, John. You need to back off while you still can." But backing off was never an option for John. He had been raised in a world where the answer to every problem was more power, more control, and more money. But this was different. No amount of money or influence could erase the wrong that had been done to Amanda and her daughter. He had to follow through, even if it meant stepping into a world far darker than the polished one he knew. His phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. The name on the screen was familiar. Detective Harris. John answered immediately. "John," Harris said, his voice tight with urgency. "We've got a break in the case." John's pulse quickened. "What happened?" "We traced a payment from Crawford Industries to Blackwell Security," Harris continued. "The amount is significant. It's tied to an account that was used to track Amanda and Lily. This wasn't just some random operation. Someone in your family knew exactly what they were doing." John felt a cold chill wash over him. Who? Who in my family?" The detective hesitated before answering, as though weighing his words carefully. "We don't know yet, but we've confirmed the connection. The payments go back years, even before Amanda disappeared. Whoever was behind this has been covering their tracks for a long time." John's mind raced as he processed the information. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture was far more complicated than he had anticipated. His family, the very people who had given him the power to build his own empire, were at the heart of this mystery. Whoever was behind these operations was hiding something far more sinister than John had imagined. "What's our next step?" John asked, his voice tight. "We need to keep pushing," Harris replied. "But we have to be careful. Whoever's involved isn't just going to sit back and let us uncover the truth. We'll need a plan." John stood up, his decision already made. "I don't care how careful we need to be. I won't stop until I find out who's behind this, and I won't stop until I make sure Lily is safe." Harris was silent for a moment before replying, his voice softer. "I get it, John. Just be careful. You're getting closer, but so are they." John didn't need to hear the warning. He had already crossed the point of no return. The next day, John found himself back in the underbelly of Brooklyn, standing outside the dilapidated house at 1423 Belmont Avenue. The house seemed even more haunting now, its walls scarred with time and neglect. He had gone through the house the other day, finding Amanda's notebook, a vital clue that had led him to this place. But there was more here, he knew it. Something was hidden in this house, something that would lead him to the answers he sought. He had come alone this time. Detective Harris had warned him about making too many waves, but John couldn't wait any longer. He had to move fast. Every minute spent sitting in the waiting room, twiddling his thumbs while the investigation crawled forward, felt like a minute too long. John pushed open the creaky gate again, his footsteps soft as he walked up to the front door. The wind had picked up, rustling the overgrown grass and making the house feel even more abandoned. He hadn't fully explored the property before, but now his gut told him there was something here, something more than a discarded notebook and a faded photo. The door creaked open with little resistance, and John stepped inside, immediately feeling the weight of the air, the stale, musty scent of a house that had been left to rot for far too long. He made his way through the house, his footsteps echoing eerily against the silence. As he passed through rooms that seemed untouched by time, he reached the small bedroom where Amanda had lived with Lily. The walls were bare, save for a few remnants of peeling wallpaper, and the floor was littered with dust. John's eyes narrowed as he spotted something that had been hidden beneath a pile of discarded papers in the corner of the room. A wooden box, small and inconspicuous, but it looked out of place among the mess. John crouched down, his hands shaking slightly as he reached for the box. The moment his fingers brushed against the smooth surface, he knew he was holding something important. He lifted the lid carefully, revealing a set of old, crinkled photographs. Images of a young Amanda, smiling, carefree, and oblivious to the horrors that awaited her. But it was the second photo that caught John's attention. It showed Amanda with a man with dark eyes and a tight smile that didn't seem right. His arms were draped around Amanda's shoulders, but there was something cold about the way he stood. John didn't recognize the man, but there was something about the picture that made his stomach churn. He flipped the photo over, his eyes scanning the back for any clue, and found a single name scrawled in messy handwriting. Victor Blackwell. John froze. The name sent a jolt through him. Blackwell. He had heard that name before. The head of Blackwell Security. The man who had orchestrated everything. The man who had been pulling the strings behind the scenes, using his family's company to cover up the truth. Victor Blackwell. The man who had been tied to Amanda's disappearance, and, by extension, Lily's life in hiding. John stood up abruptly, his heart pounding in his chest. The connection was clear now. Victor Blackwell wasn't just some contractor hired by an anonymous client. He was connected to his family. This man was a part of the darkness that had been hidden for years, buried beneath the polished exterior of Crawford Industries. The more John uncovered, the more it seemed like his family's wealth had been built on lies, corruption, and secrets that could no longer stay hidden. John slipped the photo into his jacket pocket, his mind racing. He had to confront Victor Blackwell. He had to make him pay for everything he had done to Amanda, to Lily, and to his family. And he knew exactly where to find him. John's pulse thundered in his ears as he sat in the back of his sleek black SUV, the city streets outside blurring by like a river of steel and concrete. The weight of the photo, of Victor Blackwell, felt like an anchor in his pocket. The name had been nothing more than a shadow until now, but now it was a beacon, pulling him toward the heart of the dark web his family had woven. Victor Blackwell. John had learned much about him over the past few days. The name had appeared in connection to high-profile clients, politicians, executives, business moguls, those whose secrets were as valuable as their wealth. It turned out that Blackwell wasn't just a simple private investigator. He was a fixer, a man who specialized in making inconvenient truths disappear. And as John had learned through the investigations, Blackwell had a direct hand in the disappearance of Amanda Crawford. John's fingers tightened around the wheel as the car made its way toward a place he had been avoiding. Queens. Blackwell's company, Blackwell Security, was located in a nondescript office building tucked away between two auto shops. It was a far cry from the upscale firms John was used to dealing with. A reminder that power often thrived in the shadows, away from the spotlight. John wasn't sure what he was going to find there, but the certainty gnawing at him was undeniable. He had to confront Blackwell. He had to uncover the final piece of the puzzle that had started with a little girl abandoned in an alley and a mother whose life had been erased from existence. The SUV pulled up to the building, its dull exterior offering little indication of the firestorm simmering beneath. John stared at the building for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it. There was no turning back now. The building was eerily quiet, save for the occasional hum of distant traffic. As John stepped out of the car and made his way up the worn steps to the entrance, he felt the weight of the decision settling in his bones. This wasn't a simple confrontation. It was a declaration that he would no longer remain in the dark about his family's past, nor would he allow Blackwell to continue his covert operations unchecked. The door to Blackwell Security was unlocked, and John pushed it open with a firm hand. Inside, the air was cool and impersonal, just as he had imagined. A receptionist sat at a desk in the far corner, her eyes flicking up briefly before returning to her computer screen. The room was devoid of the usual hustle and bustle of a corporate office, yet there was an unsettling stillness that made John's skin crawl. He approached the front desk, his voice firm as he addressed the receptionist. "I need to speak with Victor Blackwell." The woman barely looked up. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked, her voice disinterested. "No," John replied. "But I'm not leaving until I speak with him." She glanced at him now, her gaze sharper, more calculating. Mr. Blackwell is a very busy man. I'm aware, John said coldly. I'm sure he can make time for this. After a moment of tense silence, the receptionist nodded curtly and stood. Wait here. John watched her walk toward a door in the back of the room, his thoughts racing. He wasn't entirely sure what he would say to Blackwell, but he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't going to be a civil conversation. The man who had been orchestrating the disappearance of Amanda, the man who had caused the suffering of Lily, had to be held accountable. The secrets of John's family, the lies that had been buried beneath layers of wealth and influence, needed to be exposed. Minutes later, the door to the back office opened, and Victor Blackwell stepped out. He was a tall man, with sharp, angular features and dark eyes that carried the weight of too many secrets. His expression was cool, unreadable, as he surveyed John with an almost bored detachment. Mr. Carpenter, Blackwell said smoothly, extending a hand. I assume you are here to discuss business. John didn't take the offered hand. We need to talk, he said, his voice low and intense. Blackwell raised an eyebrow, but didn't retreat. About what exactly? John didn't waste time with pleasantries. About Amanda Crawford. About what you did to her. About the role your company played in her disappearance, and the role your family played in hiding it. The words hit Blackwell like a punch to the gut, though his expression remained calm. I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about, Mr. Carpenter, he said, his voice smooth but laced with a subtle threat. Crawford Industries, and I have never had any involvement with Amanda Crawford. You've clearly been misled. John didn't flinch. I found the photograph. Blackwell. I know exactly who you are, and I know exactly what you've been doing. You're a fixer, a man who cleans up the messes that people like you want hidden. But I'm not going to let you sweep this under the rug. Blackwell's eyes narrowed slightly. You've clearly done your research, he said, his voice now tinged with something darker. But you're making a mistake, Mr. Carpenter. You don't understand the forces you're up against. You have no idea who you're dealing with. John's anger flared, but he held it in check. I know exactly what I'm dealing with. You've been controlling the narrative, manipulating the lives of people like Amanda and her daughter for years. You think you can just make people disappear, and that no one will notice. Well, I'm noticing, Blackwell, and I'm not going to let you get away with it. The tension between them thickened, the room growing heavier with each word. John could feel the weight of the moment. This was the confrontation he had been building toward. But Blackwell's response was calculated, his every word weighed carefully. You think you're the first to try and challenge me, John. Blackwell's voice was low, almost a growl now. People like you always think you can change things. Bring justice where there's none. But the truth is, you have no idea how deep this goes. Your family, your company, they've been part of this for years. You've always been in the dark, Mr. Carpenter. You're just now starting to wake up. John stepped forward, his jaw clenched. I don't care how deep it goes. You hurt that little girl. You tore apart a family for your own gain. And I'm going to make sure you pay for it. Blackwell's eyes gleamed with something sinister, amusement, perhaps, or a twisted understanding of the game they were playing. You think you can take me down? You're nothing but a pawn in a much bigger game, John. A game you've only just begun to understand. John's mind raced as he stared at Blackwell, trying to make sense of the cryptic words. What was he talking about? A bigger game. Who was pulling the strings behind Blackwell? Who else was involved in this web of lies, manipulation, and hidden truths? Before John could speak, Blackwell turned toward the receptionist. Mr. Carpenter has been asking questions that are none of his business, he said, his tone dismissive. Please, show him out. John's heart sank as he realized what was happening. Blackwell was using his influence to shut him down, to keep him in the dark. But John wasn't going to back down. He wasn't going to let this man, or anyone, silence him. John's voice was steely. You won't get away with this, Blackwell. I'll expose you. I'll expose everything." Blackwell turned back to face him, a slow, almost predatory smile curling at the corners of his lips. "We'll see about that, John. We'll see." As John stormed out of the office, his mind was racing. Blackwell's cryptic words echoed in his mind, sending a chill through him. This was more than just a simple missing persons case. It was more than just a twisted family secret. John had unwittingly stepped into a world far darker than he could have imagined, a world where nothing was as it seemed, and the line between right and wrong had long since disappeared. The battle was just beginning, and John knew one thing for certain. He couldn't stop now. Not for Lily, not for Amanda, and not for the shattered legacy of his family. John didn't sleep that night. His mind was too full of unanswered questions, too clouded with the weight of the conversation he had just walked out of. Victor Blackwell's words echoed in his mind, cryptic, taunting, and filled with a veiled threat. It had become clear to John that this was far from just a rogue operation. This was something more significant, something far-reaching. Blackwell had been a part of it, sure, but he was only a piece of a much larger puzzle. Sitting in his penthouse, John poured himself a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid swirling in his glass as he stared out at the city that felt increasingly like a stage for a dangerous play. He had always prided himself on being in control, but the more he uncovered, the more it became clear that he was out of his depth. Whoever was behind Blackwell, whoever had been manipulating his family's legacy and hiding the truth, had much more power than John could have imagined. The image of Lily, the fragile little girl with so much fear in her eyes, kept haunting him. He had promised her he would uncover the truth, and that promise kept him grounded. But the deeper he dug, the more he realized that the forces aligned against him were not just dangerous. They were nearly omnipotent. John's family had its hands in this, and the threads of corruption ran through places he never thought to look. John needed answers. Fast. The key, he was beginning to realize, wasn't just in Blackwell's office or even in his uncle's cryptic admissions. The answers lay somewhere within the history of Crawford Industries, buried deep within the secrets of his own family's empire. But the deeper he went, the darker the truth became. The next day, John's first stop was the archives of Crawford Industries headquarters. He had spent years ignoring the company's more hidden corners, focusing only on its surface, the smooth transactions, the boardroom deals, the public face of power. But today, he was going to dig deeper, past the glitzy financial reports and the glossy public relations campaigns, and into the company's darkest recesses. He arrived at the office just as the morning rush began to calm. The hum of activity in the lobby did nothing to shake the gnawing unease growing in his stomach. Every conversation he overheard seemed irrelevant now, as if it were taking place in a different world, a world of suits and boardrooms, disconnected from the struggle he was facing. John made his way to the archives, the musty smell of old files and papers greeting him as he stepped into the room. It was a far cry from the polished, pristine offices of the upper floors. Dust and neglect had accumulated on the shelves of records, forgotten moments of history buried behind locked doors. But John had keys. He had the power to open whatever he wanted. Today, those keys felt heavier than ever. As he sifted through the stacks of documents, he found traces of his family's dealings. Contracts, financial reports, and even personal letters from his father's office. It was strange, almost surreal to see the personal handwriting of the man who had built everything John had known. And yet, as he leafed through the papers, it became increasingly clear that the empire his father had built was founded on more than just business acumen. There were layers of deception woven into the fabric of the company's success, financial dealings that looked more like manipulation than legitimate growth. Then, buried deep within the archives, John found something that made his blood run cold. A ledger, handwritten, and dated nearly 2 decades ago. It was filled with names, transactions, and what appeared to be lists of payments to various entities, businesses, security firms, individuals. The names meant nothing to John at first, but as his eyes scanned the entries, one name stood out like a red flag: Victor Blackwell. The payments were substantial, larger than any legitimate contract he had ever seen. His father had been working with Blackwell, paying him for services that were not listed, services that weren't recorded in any public document. The entries described something far more sinister than security contracts. They spoke of operations, disappearances, and confidential arrangements. John's mind reeled as he realized that his father had been part of something much darker, something that reached far beyond the boundaries of legal business. Crawford Industries was built on secrets, and somewhere along the way, those secrets had become more than just business. They had become a matter of life and death. John slammed the ledger shut, his hands trembling. This wasn't just about his family's legacy anymore. It wasn't just about his wealth or his power. It was about the lives that had been destroyed to protect the empire. Lily's mother had been one of those lives. And now, John understood that the man he had once respected as his father was a part of something monstrous. His head swam with the implications. Had his father known the truth about Amanda? Had he known what had happened to her? And had he known what Blackwell had done, what was still being done? As John left the archive room, his mind was in a daze. He had come seeking answers, but what he had uncovered was a far deeper, darker story than he had ever imagined. He needed to speak with Detective Harris. He needed help understanding the scope of the conspiracy he had just stumbled upon. But even as the detective's name ran through his mind, John knew that the clock was ticking. Whoever was behind this would stop at nothing to keep their secrets buried. And now that John was on the trail, he was a target. John didn't make it far before the first sign of trouble came. He was halfway down the corridor when he heard the sound of footsteps, too hurried, too deliberate to be a coincidence. He turned, but before he could react, a man stepped out of the shadows, blocking his path. John froze. The man was tall, his features hard and unreadable. But the moment John saw the dark sunglasses and the earpiece, his stomach twisted in recognition. The man wasn't just anyone. He was one of Blackwell's associates, one of the people who had been shadowing him ever since he started digging into the case. "Mr. Carpenter," the man said, his voice cold and clipped. "We need to talk." John's hand instinctively moved to his side, where he kept a concealed weapon for situations just like this. But before he could make a move, the man held up his hand in a calm, practiced gesture. "We're not here to hurt you," the man said, his voice laced with menace. "We just want you to understand the consequences of your actions." John met his gaze, unwavering. "What do you want?" "We want you to stop," the man replied, his voice low. "Stop digging into things you don't understand. If you don't, things will get complicated." John's mind raced as the man's words sunk in. There was no pretending now. They weren't just trying to intimidate him. They were trying to scare him into submission. But John wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not after everything he had uncovered. "I'm not stopping," John said firmly, his voice cutting through the tension. "And you can't stop me either." The man's eyes flickered, a flash of something. Anger, maybe, passing through them. But he didn't make a move. Instead, he simply smiled, a cold, calculating smile. "We'll see about that," he said, before turning and walking away, leaving John standing in the hallway, his heart hammering in his chest. John wasn't sure what would come next, but he knew one thing for sure. He had crossed a line, and there was no turning back now. John stood in the silent hallway, his breath shallow, every step echoing in his mind. The man in the hallway had left him with a chilling certainty. The world John had thought he understood, the world of power, wealth, and influence, was nothing more than a carefully constructed facade. Behind it lay a much darker reality, one where families were torn apart, and lives were manipulated for the sake of greed and control. He had walked into this journey searching for answers, for justice, and in the process, he had uncovered the truth about his family, about his father's legacy, and the shadowy figures that had pulled the strings of their lives. The lies, the hidden payments, the dangerous secrets. John had thought it was just about saving a little girl, but in truth, it had been about saving his own soul. In that moment, John knew he had a choice to make. The forces surrounding him were powerful, and the truth he had uncovered had exposed his family's involvement in far more than just a missing person case. The web of lies was vast, and there were people out there who would stop at nothing to keep those secrets hidden. He could feel the weight of their threats, the pressure building from all sides, urging him to stop, to turn back, to ignore the truth. But John had come too far to turn away now. His phone buzzed, breaking his thoughts. It was Detective Harris. "John, I got something," Harris said, his voice urgent. "You need to hear this." John's pulse quickened. "What is it?" "There's a meeting scheduled," Harris continued. "Blackwell and some people connected to Crawford Industries are meeting tomorrow. It's time. You need to be there." John's mind spun. This was it, the final piece of the puzzle. He couldn't afford to back down now. Whatever the cost, he had to be there. He had to confront the people responsible for the lies, for the pain, and for Lily's future. The next morning, John found himself in a dimly lit conference room, the air thick with tension. He wasn't alone. Detective Harris had arranged for a few trusted officers to keep an eye on the situation. John sat at the back of the room, watching as Victor Blackwell and a few others he recognized from Crawford Industries entered, their faces cold, calculating. But there was something else in their eyes. Fear. They knew John was onto them. They knew that their time was running out. Blackwell's eyes scanned the room before settling on John, a knowing smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. "I should have known you'd show up," Blackwell said, his voice smooth but edged with menace. John stood up, his voice steady. "It's over, Blackwell. I know everything. I know what you did to Amanda. I know what you've been hiding. And I'm not walking away until you're held accountable." The room was silent for a moment. For the first time, John could see the cracks in Blackwell's armor. The man was used to being in control, used to making people disappear without question. But now he was on the defensive. "You think you can stop this," Blackwell said, his tone icy. "You think you can take down everything we've built. You're just one man." John didn't flinch. "I'm not alone. I've got the truth on my side. And no one, not even you, can bury the truth forever." There was a long pause, as if the room itself held its breath. Then Harris stepped forward, flanked by the officers. The evidence John had gathered, the payments, the connections, the ledgers, was now in the hands of law enforcement. Blackwell's empire was crumbling. "You're under arrest," Harris said firmly, "for conspiracy, fraud, and the disappearance of Amanda Crawford. Your little operation is over." For the first time, in what seemed like forever, John felt a rush of relief. It wasn't the kind of victory he had imagined, the kind of victory that came with triumph and applause. But it was a victory nonetheless. The truth had won. The lies, the manipulation, the suffering. It had all been exposed, and while the road ahead would be long, John knew one thing for certain. He would never again allow himself to be a pawn in a game of shadows. Weeks later, after the dust had settled and the investigations were underway, John sat in the quiet of his penthouse, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He thought about Lily, who was finally beginning to heal, and Amanda, whose courage had never been fully appreciated. She had fought for her daughter's safety, even when she had no one else to turn to. And now, in the aftermath, John was left with a new understanding of what it meant to fight for what's right. John had always believed that power came from wealth, control, and influence. But now he understood that true power came from standing up for the truth, no matter the cost. He had sacrificed his peace of mind, his safety, and his view of the world to uncover what had been hidden for so long. But in the end, it had been worth it. He had not only uncovered the truth about Amanda and Lily, but he had also uncovered the truth about himself. The world John had known, the world of mergers, deals, and control, had been an illusion. It was a world where the cost of success had been paid in lives and trust. But now, John was free of that illusion. He had learned that real success wasn't about money or power. It was about the people you protect, the lives you change, and the justice you fight for, even when the world tells you to look the other way. As John looked out over the skyline, he knew that the future would not be easy. The scars of the past would never fully heal, and there would be challenges ahead. But one thing had changed forever. John Carpenter was no longer the man he had been. He was no longer just a millionaire businessman. He was someone who had learned the hardest lesson of all, the value of truth, of justice, and of the courage to stand against those who would silence it. And with that knowledge, John finally understood that the only way forward was to continue fighting for what was right. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.